In front of me right now is a hyper-modern rectangular building with oddly curved modern apartments poking out of the top. Outside there are landscape gardens and litter-free roads. This, right here, is the largest Tesco's in London. Tesco's is the largest supermarket chain in the UK. There are over 4,500 Tesco stores like this across the country. They sell more groceries to Brits than any other company. And this mammoth company, with its £60 billion in annual revenue, is the UK's largest private employer. Over 330,000 employees work here. Now, technically, there is one other company that employs more people, but it's a contract company that provides staff for other organisations. They technically have more staff, but those staff all work at other firms, which is why I'm here at London's largest Tesco's. Now, each of these 330,000 employees went through a job interview to work here. Staff turnover is at about 30% each year, which combined with a steady growth of jobs means that Tesco hires around 100,000 employees a year. Assuming 10 interviews per role, that means that Tesco conducts 1 million job interviews per year. And yet, there's a chance that all 1 million of these interviews are utterly pointless. Today, I'm exploring the studies behind interviews and trying to answer a controversial question. Are most job interviews pointless? Researchers Ulrich and Trumbo surveyed 852 organisations and found something we all know. 99% of private companies use job interviews to pick their staff. This isn't a surprise. Job interviews are ubiquitous. It's how you get a job, whether that's a job at Tesco's or at your local corner shop. We all assume this is the right way of doing business. It makes intuitive sense that meeting someone face to face and asking them questions is simply the best way to determine whether they're a good fit. We believe that we're good judges of character and that we'll be able to pick the right candidate for the job. And yet, a growing number of papers suggest that we're not quite as good at interviews as we'd predict. Psychologist Paul Mihel from the University of Minnesota was one of those who questioned the validity of job interviews. He reviewed the results of 20 separate studies that analysed whether subjective interviews, i.e. the interviews companies like Tesco run, were more accurate than statistical predictions. In his studies, trained counsellors were asked to predict the grades of freshmen at the end of the school year. The counsellors interviewed each student for 45 minutes. They also had access to the students' high school grades, several aptitude tests, and a 4-page personal statement. The counsellors' predictions were then compared to the predictions made by statistical algorithms. Now, this algorithm obviously couldn't interview the student, and so it only used a fraction of the information that the counsellor had available. It was able to use the high school grades and one aptitude test. And then, like the counsellor, the algorithm was asked to predict the grades of the students. And the algorithm won. It predicted students' grades more accurately than 11 out of the 10 counsellors. Interviews, it appeared, weren't very effective at forecasting people's futures. In 1994, 4 other researchers published a paper titled The Validity of Employment Interviews. This team analysed 86,311 individuals to determine just how effective interviews were. They compared 3 interview types. The first was situational interviews, where the interviewer watches a candidate do the job. The second was job-related interviews, where the interviewer asks the candidate about the job. And the third was psychological interviews, where the interviewer asks the candidates about themselves. Now, unsurprisingly, the psychological interviews were the worst. They provided very little validity. But more interesting was just how poor the job-related interviews were. In the UK, almost every employer uses job-related interviews. You sit down for an interview and you ask, what would you do if you were in this scenario? What experience do you have doing this job? All stuff like that. It's usually impossible to conduct situational interviews in which the employee is watched performing the job. So most hiring teams resort to job-related interviews in which the candidate is asked about the job. But according to these studies, job-related interviews were 22% worse at identifying suitable candidates than the situational interviews. It shows how poor we all are at forecasting future job performance. And I say we, because it's not just hiring managers, it is all of us, from Tesco team leads to British prime ministers. On September 15th, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain left London and flew to Munich. He took his first ever flight to meet Adolf Hitler. It was a crucial meeting. Hitler had been making increasingly threatening statements about invading Sudetenland, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. If Hitler did invade, it would mean almost certain world war. So Chamberlain did something no other major world leader, including Roosevelt, Stalin or Churchill, did. He flew to Munich to meet him. Chamberlain believed what 99% of modern-day business people believe, that meeting face-to-face is the best way to learn about someone's character. After meeting with Hitler, Chamberlain was relieved. He wrote letters to his sister saying he had established a certain confidence. In spite of the hardness and ruthlessness I thought I saw in his face, I got the impression that here was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word. Chamberlain's interview with Hitler was widely regarded as one of the greatest mistakes in the Second World War. Chamberlain fell under Hitler's spell. Malcolm Gladwell's account of this history in his book Talking to Strangers states that he was outmaneuvered at the bargaining table. He misread Hitler's intentions and failed to warn Hitler that if he renegated on his promises, there would be serious consequences. Despite promising not to, Hitler did invade Czechoslovakia and then Poland, breaking his agreement with Chamberlain and starting World War II. Most of us have heard this story, and most of us lament Chamberlain for his foolishness. How could he have been so naive? But what if Chamberlain wasn't the exception and instead was the norm? What if all of us are worse judges of character than we think? The best answer we have to that question comes from a study conducted by Harvard economist Senthil Moonhelanen. He and his team collected records from 550,000 New York criminal defendants from 2008 to 2013. All these defendants have an interview with the judge during which they are questioned. Evidence is presented, and ultimately, just like a job interview, the judge determines what should happen to them. Should they go to prison or should they be released? Of the 550,000 people, just over 400,000 were released by judges in New York. So, were these forecasts by the judges, were they accurate? Well, to test that, the research team built an AI system. They fed it with the same information that the prosecutors had given the judges and told the AI to go through each case and decide who should be released. It was human interview versus an AI prediction, man versus machine. Now, who was better at forecasting? Well, the results weren't even close. The people on the AI's list were 25% less likely to commit a crime while awaiting trial than the 400,000 released by human judges. AI was more accurate at predicting future human behaviour than the humans. The interviews, it seems, had failed again. So far, I've shared evidence from mega studies on 80,000 interviews, an analysis of 500,000 court cases, and one meeting with Hitler. All of these examples seem to show that interviews aren't great at predicting human behaviour. But why is this? Why are we so bad at analysing others? And seeing as we're so bad at it, why do we keep doing it? Why does Tesco still interview 1 million people a year? Well, I found answers in the book Talking to Strangers. The book cites the incredible research by Emily Pronin. For this study, Pronin gave a group of people incomplete words like blank blank TER and then asked them to complete the word. So you could complete that word as hater or later or rater, for example. Now, once the participants had filled out the blank words, she asked each participant what their own answers said about themselves. If one person, for example, had filled out mainly negative words like hater or loser, for example, would that mean anything? The participants were asked and they said, no, they are just words. One said, I don't really think my word completions reveal that much about me. It occurred as a result of happenstance. The vast majority of people agreed with this person's point of view. But then things got interesting. Pronin gave the group other people's words, and she asked them the same question, but this time about other people. What do you think the choice of their words revealed? This time, Pronin's participants completely changed their mind. One person declared, I get the feeling whoever wrote this is pretty vain, but basically a nice guy. Another answered, "I have a feeling that the individual in question may be tired very often in his or her life. In addition, I think that he or she might be interested in having a close personal interaction with someone of the opposite sex. This person may also enjoy playing games." When analysing the words of others, the majority of participants now believed that these word completions did have meaning. Cronin calls this the illusion of asymmetric insight. It's a bias that's visible in almost all of us. It's the conviction that we know others better than they know us, and that we may have the insights about them that they lack. In other words, we believe that we're good at interviewing others to understand them, but that others are bad at interviewing us and understanding us. This study answered my first question. Humans think they're good at interviewing because of this illusion of asymmetric insight. That is why 99% of companies still use job interviews, even though the evidence suggests that they're not very effective. Which leads me to my next question. Is there a better way of conducting an interview? We've already discovered via the mega study that situational interviews are best, but they're largely impossible for most job interviewers. Tesco can't ask a marketer to just do the job for 30 minutes to see how good they are. It's not possible to just do marketing for 30 minutes for Tesco. So, assuming that we still have to conduct interviews in the traditional format, what's the best way to do it? That is the question that the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman asked himself back in 1955. At the time, he was a 21-year-old lieutenant in the Israeli Defense Forces. He was assigned to set up an interview system for the entire army. The pre-existing interview routine used by the army was typical of how most of today's private companies hire. The interviewers, selected for their high intelligence and interest in dealing with people, conducted 15 to 20-minute interviews covering various topics to form a general impression of the recruit's performance in the army. As you won't be surprised to hear, Kahneman found that this type of interview was almost completely useless at predicting the future success of the recruits. Kahneman had to design a better format. He had read Paul Meehl's research and agreed that simple statistical rules were superior to subjective judgments that most interviewers make. Kahneman concluded that subjective interviews failed at least in part because it allowed the interviewer to do what they found most interesting, which was to learn about the dynamics of the interviewee's mental life. Instead, he said, we should use the limited time to obtain as much specific information as possible about the interviewee's life in his normal environment. So, Kahneman designed a procedure in which interviewers evaluated candidates on several different traits, scored each one separately, and combined the final score to determine the outcome. He identified 6 characteristics that he thought were vital to performance, including responsibility, sociability, and pride. For each characteristic, he proposed a series of factual questions to determine their performance in each characteristic. The idea was to evaluate the candidate objectively across a range of pre-described characteristics rather than evaluate the candidate subjectively across random characteristics that just popped into the interviewer's head. By focusing on standardized factual questions, he hoped to combat the halo effect, where one favorable first impression influences later judgments. As a further precaution against halos, he instructed the interviewers to go through 6 traits in a fixed sequence, rating each trait on a 5-point scale before going on to the next. Unsurprisingly, the existing interviewers in the army did not appreciate Kahneman's suggestions. One of them complained that, "You are turning us into robots." They came close to mutiny, but ultimately they complied. Using this new method, several hundred interviews were conducted, and a few months later, the team collected evaluations of the soldiers' performance from the commanding officers of the units to which they had been assigned, and the results were astounding. The new interview procedure was a substantial improvement over the old one. As Kahneman writes in Thinking Fast and Slow, the sum of our 6 ratings predicted soldiers' performance much more accurately than the global evaluations of the previous interviewing method. Although far from perfect, we had progressed from completely useless to moderately useful. I started today's show in a car park, wondering if job interviews might be pointless. I think they might be. There's a wealth of research that showcases how we're woeful at forecasting behaviour. Basic statistical models and trained AIs seem to do a vastly better job than us. And yet, that's not the solution. Our society wouldn't allow for an AI to decide who goes to prison or for a statistical algorithm to determine who gets the job. Even if job interviews are inherently flawed, they are also socially necessary. We need hiring processes to be human. It might not be accurate, but the alternative wouldn't be tolerated. Requiring humanity means introducing imperfection. We spend job interviews asking the wrong questions and making the wrong conclusions. But Kahneman has a solution. Rather than acting like humans in an interview, recruiters should act a little bit more like statistical algorithms, ranking candidates across 6 characteristics on a score from 1 to 5, and then summarising that score has been proven to work better. This combination of statistical analysis and human connection seems to offer the best solution. This method would dramatically improve job interviews, and it might have even helped Chamberlain determine that Hitler was ready for war. Now, I spent 3 hours travelling through rush hour in London to stand in a car park to record the opening of this podcast. And if that doesn't show how committed I am to providing you with the world's best behavioural science podcast, then I don't know what will. If you enjoyed today's show, I'd appreciate it if you shared it with a friend or left a 5-star review. Both of those really do help me, so thank you if you do take the time to do either of those. Now, there were 2 main sources for today's episode. The first was Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. It's a good read. It reveals exactly why we're so bad at understanding others and what we can do about it. So do check that out if you haven't read it yet. The second source was the late, great Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. His studies on interviews were vital for this episode, and his book is a must-read for anyone looking to apply behavioural science. So do go check that out. If you want more from me, from Nudge, you can of course follow me. Just search for Phil Agnew on LinkedIn and Twitter, or Nudge Podcast on Facebook, Instagram and TikTok. But I save all of my best insights for my newsletter, which I send every Friday. So to subscribe to that, head to nudgepodcast.com and click newsletter. It's free and you can unsubscribe at any time with just a click. All right, that is all for today. I'm Phil Agnew, the host of Nudge. Thank you for listening.